says, surely a state of nature is more excellent than that. There we agree. Now here I've got one paragraph that sums up his entire Essex result, as again it's called. All men are born equally free. The rights they possess at their birth are equal and of the same kind. Some of those rights are alienable and may be parted with for an equivalent. That's kind of arrogant. He's saying that our God-given rights can be parted with for an equivalent given to us by men. I don't think that's working. Others are unalienable and inherent, and of that importance that no equivalent can be received in exchange. Sometimes we shall mention the surrendering of a power to control our rights, which is perhaps speaking with more precision than when we use the expression of parting with natural rights, but the same thing is intended. Those rights which are unalienable and of that importance are called the rights of conscience. We have duties for the discharge of which we are accountable to our Creator and Benefactor, which no human power can cancel. What those duties are is determined by right reason, which may be and is called a well-informed conscience. What this conscience dictates as our duty is so, and that power which assumes the control over it is an usurper, for no consent can be pleaded to justify the control, as any consent in this case is void. The alienation of some rights in themselves alienable may also be void if the bargain is of that nature that no equivalent can be received. Thus, if a man surrender all his alienable rights without reserving a control over the supreme power, or a right to resume in certain cases, the surrender is void. For he becomes a slave, and a slave can receive no equivalent. Common equity would set aside this bargain. Did you catch that? Thus, if a man surrender all his alienable rights without reserving a control over the supreme power, or a right to resume his state of nature, in certain cases, the surrender is void. Now that's Parsons. Parsons didn't write the Constitution. He didn't write the Bill of Rights. But he laid the foundation for what James Madison put into the First Amendment. I could go on with Parsons here, but I'll read this one. In a state of nature, every man had the sovereign control over his own person. He might also have in that state a qualified property. Whatever lands or chattels he had acquired in peaceful possession of were exclusively his, by right of occupancy or possession. For while they were unpossessed, he had a right to them equally with any other men, and therefore could not be disturbed in his possession without being injured. For no man could lawfully dispossess him, without having a better right, which no man had. Over this qualified property, every man in a state of nature also had a sovereign control. You've heard of sovereignty, and those fellows that call themselves sovereign citizens, well, it's an oxymoron. But every man is sovereign upon being inserted into the state of nature as he's inserted into this realm. But you waive that sovereignty when you join society. And as Parsons says, if a man doesn't have some reserve, some way to re-exert his power as a sovereign, then his surrender is void, which, people in America, I don't think they feel very powerful today. What I'm trying to do tonight is give you some portions of what was intended for the power we are intended to have at the individual level. If you understand the First Amendment, you see that it's got just as sharp a teeth as the Second. Now we've touched a little bit on the religious aspect of the First Amendment. At the end, it talks about a petition for redress of grievance. Does anybody who hasn't spoken to me about it have any idea what a petition for redress of grievance, what the origin of that concept is? In English Parliament back in the day, the petition to redress a grievance was withholding taxes from the king until he resolved the grievance. James Madison put that right at the individual level in the Constitution of America. Why didn't we learn that in school? How quick would we solve all of our problems if we exercised that right alone? Touch on that just a little bit further. There was another researcher, I think now deceased, named Anthony Hargis. He went toe to toe with the IRS for decades, had a lot of successes, had just enough losses. It doesn't take many with the IRS. They kind of turned him into a target, and if you saw much of what he wrote, you'd understand why. But here's what the Continental Congress in 1774 told citizens of Quebec in an attempt to get them to side with the Americans in the Revolution. If money is wanted by rulers who have in any manner oppressed the people, they may retain it until their grievances are redressed, and thus peacefully procure relief without trusting to despised petitions or disturbing the public tranquility. What he's saying is, we don't need another revolution. We'll just withhold taxes until they get their act together. And that was referenced in the American Congress 1774, American Politic, number 233. I'm going to read a little bit more of what Hargis says here before we go on, because this redress of grievance is a pretty big deal. This quotation comes from the appeal to the inhabitants of Quebec issued by the Continental Congress. Its purpose was to persuade the inhabitants of Quebec to join the pending revolution. Members of this Congress listed their complaints against King George and then enumerated the three great rights of Englishmen for which Americans were about to contend. The letter was dated October 26th of the year 1774. The first great right, they declared, is the right of self-government. The second great right, which is derived from the first, is the right of redress of grievance. Third great right is the trial by a jury of one's peers. When men employ persuasion to gain allies, their struggle is necessarily interpreted as a joint effort to engrave their promises in stone. If a victory is obtained and promises are renounced, the result is a cause of action that gives one side the right to prosecute the other. It is basic contractual law. Promises made to gain ratification comprise the contract. Much has been written about the first and third great rights, but scholars, lawyers, and judges have failed us on the second, or perhaps they have betrayed us. According to the right of redress, as the founders described it, we have a right to withhold taxes if the government violates our rights. But as American courts prescribe the right, we must suffer the injury, pay taxes, and then, if we have anything left, sue for redress. The nostrum that taxes are to be paid before redress is asserted by Congress in Title 26 of the U.S. Code, which is the IRS's theoretical founding document, which states, among other things, no suit for the purpose of restraining the assessment or collection of any tax shall be maintained in any court by any person, whether or not such person is the person against whom the tax was assessed. Now, I can clue you in a little bit. When they use the word person, anytime you see the word person in a statute or in the law, they are referring to your corporation side. If you have and use a social security number, you are considered as a corporation with no natural rights. Hale versus Henkel is a 1906 court case that very clearly draws the distinction between the individual and the corporation as pertains to his rights under government. And it's another fascinating, powerful read. I should have probably brought that tonight. But there's so many different legs to this whole thing. Each one of them could have a volume of books written about it. I hope to perfect my presentations and bring more of these topics to your attention. But here is the clincher. Here's what James Madison had to say when the Commonwealth of Virginia tried to pass a law basically backing and funding a Christian, it was a school. I'll just read this first part. We, the subscribers, citizens of the said Commonwealth, having taken into serious consideration a bill printed by order of the last session of General Assembly, entitled, A Bill Establishing a Provision for Teachers of the Christian Religion, and conceiving that the same, if finally armed with the sanctions of law, will be a dangerous abuse of power, are bound as faithful members of a free state to remonstrate against it and to declare the reasons by which we are determined. We will remonstrate against the said bill. 1. because we hold it for a fundamental and undeniable truth that religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. He was there quoting the Virginia Declaration of Rights, Article 16. The religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. This right is in its nature an unalienable right. It is unalienable because the opinions of men, depending only on the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men. It is unalienable also because what is here a right toward men is a duty toward the Creator. It is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This duty is precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of civil society. Now right there he said it all. If civil society is going off the rails and you see corruption and abominations to our Creator in every direction, what's your only course of action? It's too late to apply the redress of grievance one at a time. The only thing left is to depart. And I'll get to that in a little bit. Before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe. And if a member of civil society who enters into any subordinate association must always do it with the reservation of his duty to the general authority, much more must every man who becomes a member of any particular civil society do it with a saving of his allegiance to the universal sovereign. We maintain, therefore, that in matters of religion, no man's right is abridged by the institution of civil society, and that religion is wholly exempt from its cognizance. True it is that no other rule exists by which any question which may divide a society can be ultimately determined by the will of the majority, but it is also true that the majority may trespass on the rights of the minority. So right there, he established conscience. A man's conscience is superior to the authority of state. But I will tell you in my experience that the state knows the difference between one who's trying to play the game, ride the fence, and those who are legitimately making a departure on conscience. And they will test, and they will research, and they will see where you're really at. I quit filing with the IRS in 1997. 1999, I started getting the paperwork out of Kansas City. I might have read the first couple, how come you're not filing? Basically, it's all kind of computer generated. And I blew it off for the longest time, and the envelopes just kept getting thicker and thicker. And I was right in the thick of another major legal battle. One night I was laying in bed, and I asked my Heavenly Father. I wasn't particularly scared by this time. I was spent. I was completely spent for having fighting the state on other issues. And it came to me that I was to write a letter to the director of the IRS in Washington, D.C., stating 3 basic points. I'm not a U.S. citizen, which we'll get into in a later. That's a major issue. You don't want to be a U.S. citizen. I can no longer swear an oath at the end of my 1040, your 1040 form, in that I am a U.S. citizen, because Matthew 5:34 of the Holy Scriptures, Messiah himself forbids it. He says, above all things, my brethren, swear not at all. And then James 5:12, the same thing is said, swear not at all. And if you look at some of the history, there's some writings about English history and the swearing of oaths. Oath spoken is jurisdiction. You're giving them jurisdiction by swearing that oath, and that's why the Bible warns against it. And thirdly, in my letter to the IRS director, I said I can no longer give the impression that I'm trying to serve 2 masters. I apologize for my previous affiliation with their office. I sent back some earned income tax credit that I didn't understand why I was getting a check from the IRS when I hadn't paid anything in, and that was basically a form of welfare. I sent that back, and I never saw anything out of Kansas City again, ever, and that's been since 1999. 2 or 3 months after I sent that letter, I got a letter from the Illinois Department of Revenue Income Division. How come you're not filing taxes? I said, funny you should ask. Here's what I sent to Charles Rosati in Washington, D.C. I haven't heard from the state of Illinois again. There's the power of swearing the oath and the power of saying, I can't swear any more oaths. Now, I got wind from friends that I did business with that they got a call from the IRS asking a few questions. And I'm positive the IRS would have gone around. You, on your bank card, I think you're swearing under penalty of perjury. Your voter's registration card, your driver license application, maybe your marriage license, you're swearing under penalties of perjury that you're a U.S. citizen. I'm certain the IRS looked at all that, and I had already gotten rid of all of it. So they saw, okay, this guy's for real, we're done. We have no jurisdiction over him. I'm going to give you one hint. In the U.S. Code today, Title 42, Section 1981 and 1982, there is a distinction drawn between a white citizen and a U.S. citizen. The white citizen is the original. All of our founding fathers were white, and they created this country, it says, for their posterity. Here we are in a mixed bag. I'm not a racist. I have no, these guys all talk about all the races, all men are equal, and I believe that. But our founders wanted us to be a European-based, those people make the law. And I don't know much of the history about who had slaves. I don't know the history of which of our founders may have still had a hand in the 1840s, roughly, they created the U.S. citizen. They created that class of citizen to accommodate the blacks, the Native Americans, and the mulattoes into American society without giving them any rights, particularly the right to vote. Since then, they've kind of backed it off a little bit and soft pedaled it a little bit. But I can show you court cases where it's very clear the distinction, how the government sees the white citizen, which Anthony Hargis, he's got another paper, another essay out called Plantation America, No Whites Allowed. Well, in the U.S. Code, where they make the distinction, they also say that U.S. citizens shall have the same rights, privileges, blah, 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 as white citizens. Why even draw the distinction? And if it's so important, and they have the same rights, how come IRS is making sure that, one, you break faith with the Messiah who ordered us, commanded us not to swear an oath, and two, that you're swearing that you're a U.S. citizen? Why is it so important to the IRS? They can deal with that lower class of citizen. They can't do business with the white citizens, who obviously have to know their P's and Q's in this day and age. You can fall into a legal trap anywhere, anytime you sign anything, if you don't know exactly what you're doing. Like I said, there's a lot to it. There's a lot of topics that need to be covered. But the first and foremost I want to give you here tonight is your right of conscience is unalienable. If your conscience tells you you can't participate, if your conscience tells you you can't contribute to these causes, that this at this point in time, satanic state is demanding, you've got a leg to stand on, but you're kind of going to be alone. Kind of. I'd like to see that change, and that's why I'm talking about this tonight, and that's why I've done all this. A friend of mine who's in this room asked me after reading one of my more extensive documents, Tim, where did you find the time to do all this research? And I haven't ever given her a good answer, but I'm going to answer it tonight. It came to my mind, I knew I was right. I knew absolutely, and in all my departures and my resistance, which isn't so much a resistance, it's just, hey, I'm out. I can't play the game anymore. I had a choice. I could just sit down there with a gun and wait. Or I could educate myself and educate my enemy, so to speak, which I've had a lot of success doing that, and I hope to have a lot more. But that's the name of the game. There's another maxim I came across once that says, it is not the duty of government to keep the people from falling into error. It's the duty of the people to keep the government from falling into error. And putting a Trump sign in your yard and voting ain't cutting. We've got rights that we need to be exercising. And that brings us back to my first point. The people are treating the state as though it's God. And bringing you Blackstone and Locke tonight, and Parsons, and what Madison has to say about his First Amendment. I'm trying to show you that The state ain't God. And your sovereignty is more powerful than the state. And I'll get into that because Parsons referenced an informed conscience. And I've got some of my own writings that are the result of my informed conscience. We'll close with that here in a bit. First, I want to go on to what James Madison had to say in point 2. Because if religion, which at the time was synonymous with conscience, Madison's peers, Sam Adams being one of them, I've got several of their quotes. They were expressing their delight amongst each other that Madison got his amendment of conscience passed. Because if religion be exempt from the authority of the society at large, still less can it be subject to that of the legislative body. The latter are but creatures and vicegerents of the former. Their jurisdiction is both derivative and limited. It is limited with regard to the coordinate departments, more necessarily it is limited with regard to the constituents. The preservation of a free government requires not merely that the metes and bounds which separate each department of power be invariably maintained, but more especially that neither of them be suffered to overlap the great barrier which defends the rights of the people. The rulers who are guilty of such an encroachment exceed the commissions from which they derive their authority and are tyrants. The people who submit to it are governed by laws made neither by themselves nor by any authority derived from them, and are slaves. This is another document that everybody should have a copy of. It's called James Madison Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. Emma's going to have this stuff in her notes, and I think all these documents need to be listed on our site. They're all online, oddly enough. In fact, the University of Chicago, as I find evidence of these and I look them up, I've found lots of different sources putting some of these documents out there online. And then I go to the University of Chicago, which puts a lot of these out online, and I see that only the University of Chicago is putting out the whole document. Or I should say, all of the other ones I find are abridged, and sometimes they leave out a pretty major point, or 2 or 5. The University of Chicago is keeping some of this stuff online, and I'm proud. I'll say it. I'm proud of them, because what these men bring to the table is long forgotten, long overdue to be brought back to the table. Like I said, I could go on, especially with this from Madison, but I'm going to try to keep this, and we're getting close here. These are my own personal thoughts after years, and I've been at this for 30 years. I've got lots of writings at home, I've got lots of books, I've got some very old law dictionaries, and I've read a lot. And I've been cognizant of my subject, my created nature. I was raised in the church, steeped in it, ridiculously. But as a youth, my dad was always the minister of music. Any church we went to. And I remember reading through the hymnal as people are singing. You know, they're all sing-song and just living it up. And I'm reading the words that were penned probably by some of the martyrs, previous to Hooker. I'm thinking, these people have no idea what they're singing about. This is a tragedy. And it's just entertainment to these people. So that was my mentality in my single digit years. I've always known. And as I find these writings and I find these concepts, it fascinates and it empowers me, because where's the verse in the Bible that talks about those that have a form of godliness but deny the power thereof? Okay, my writings. Number 1. No man can begin to enjoy the full expression of his God-given rights, nor the full experience of an authentic pursuit of happiness, who is forced to live on land not his own, nor on land over which any other entity, be that entity public or private, has any servitude interest, such as rent, tax, or regulatory power. Conscience can never be secure nor free in expression, but will always remain vulnerable, insecure in expression, and punishable under such a compromise. Absolute dominion over land, subject only to God, must always remain available to the individual, lest life have the potential to become no more than an insufferable curse. In America, absolute dominion over land is crucial to the individual for the free expression of conscience and the free exercise of religion to remain unencumbered, as both are protected by the First Amendment. Without absolute security in land, the freedom of religion clause of the First Amendment is moot. Number 2, the kingdom of heaven, or kingdom of God, as referenced by Messiah in the New Testament, is the remanifestation of God's original gift to man of the perfect law of liberty in the state of nature, where there is no rule nor absolute force save that of Messiah, under God. The protections referenced and secured in Psalms 91 are meant for that natural state alone, and do not carry over to the fickle societies of men. Okay, right there. Somebody open up, King James is my preference. Judges 10, verse 14.
Go and cry unto the gods which ye have chosen. Let them deliver you in the time of your tribulation.
That word gods comes from Elohim. Has anybody ever looked up Elohim in, what's the famous concordance? Strong's. Yeah. It comes from a word, the Elohim means judges, magistrates, and rulers. It's a generic term in that particular application. Anybody see where I'm going with this? That's why the commandment, thou shalt have no gods before me. That's what he's talking about. Number 3, in America, where sovereignty ultimately resides in the individual, there is no general submission to authority, but to oblige the common law for the remedy of criminal acts. No man can be forced to contribute, but only to abstain from the benefits for which others choose to contribute, to which the individual otherwise has no natural right. In other words, if you withdraw from society, you no longer have access to those benefits to which you do not have a natural right, but you are in possession of and entitled to the full exercise of all of your natural rights. I've had people, who know where I'm up to say, well, what about the roads? Shouldn't you pay for the roads? Well, you have a natural right to travel on the roads, and the case laws are clear that traffic, which is the commercial use of the road for hire, you're hauling persons or products for someone else for hire. That's traffic. Traffic was intended to fund the roads, whereas the roads were intended for private travel, which that in itself is another big can of worms that needs to be opened sometimes, the difference between driving and traveling. Number 4, given the absolute liberties inherent in God's gift to man of the perfect law of liberty, embodied in the state of nature, and the binding tendencies inherent in civil society, as it purportedly offers security and protections, theoretically more convenient than those found in the state of nature, for a price, and that price being man's own God-given autonomy, including a portion of his substance and a portion of his conscience, it is my contention that an early American Congress established the United States land patent to offer American landowners the best of both worlds, the benefits of society, if they so desire, for a price, or a complete reservation of their God-given autonomy with an absolute recognition by society and their representatives in government of the rights and secured borders of the so removed individual as he chooses to remain in the state of nature on American soil. Conscience fully intact, full expression of religious liberties without impediment. And like I said, these are my writings. These are pieces that I've written in other people's books. After I read a chapter, these thoughts just come to mind and I scribble them down. And I thought maybe it'd be a good thing to put them on paper and share them. Number 5, Henry David Thoreau had it right. The man of conscience, upon ridiculously minimal reflection, can come to no other conclusion but to have absolutely nothing to do with civil government, as its historical near immediate devolution from whatever lofty beginnings it may have enjoyed as a certainty. Thomas Jefferson enlightens us perfectly with his following quote, and this was another powerhouse quote that I stumbled across years ago. I am not among those who fear people, the people. They and not the rich are our dependents for continued freedom. And to preserve their independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. We must make our election between economy and liberty, or profusion and servitude. Catch that? We must make our election between economy and liberty. Do you want an economy, or do you want your liberty? Profusion and servitude. If we run into such debts as that we must be taxed in our meat and in our drink, in our necessary and our comforts, in our labors and our amusements, for our callings and our creeds, as the people of England are, our people, like them, must come to labor 16 hours in the 24, give the earnings of 15 of those to the government for their debts and daily expenses, and the 16th being insufficient to afford us bread, we must live as they do now on oatmeal and potatoes. Have no time to think, no means of calling their mismanagers to account, but be glad to obtain subsistence by hiring ourselves to rivet their chains on the necks of our fellow sufferers. Our landholders too, like theirs, retaining indeed the title and stewardship of estates called theirs, but held really just in trust for the treasury, must wander, like theirs, in foreign countries, and be contented with penury, obscurity, exile, and the glory of the nation. This example leads us to the salutary lesson that private fortunes are destroyed by public as well as by private extravagance. And this is the tendency of all human governments. And here's where he nails it. A departure from principle in one instance becomes a precedent for a second, and that second for a third, and so on, till the bulk of society is reduced to be mere automatons of misery, and to have no sensibilities left but for sinning and suffering. Then begins, indeed, the bellum omnium in omnia. I looked that up. It's Latin. War of all against all. Which some philosophers, observing to be so general in this world, have mistaken it for the natural instead of the abusive state of man. And the forehorse of this frightful team is public debt. Taxation follows that, and in its train, wretchedness and repression. I love that quote. And then I go on. Civil government always devolves to the point that it and the society it dubiously serves inevitably fawn at the feet of Satan for even more power and licentiousness than that which was originally endowed upon it by those foolish enough to part with God-given rights in exchange for a place at Caesar's table. All of men's politics is a joke until the chosen representatives begin applying the people's otherwise God-given resources taken by way of taxes to such as the aborting of God's little ones from their mother's womb, and destroying in the public schools the morality, intellect, and spirit of God's little ones who survive in America the ever increasingly dangerous gestation period. Revelations 18:4. Would somebody read that?
And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues.
Partakers of her sins. Come out of her, my people. How can we as a nation for 50 years be funding the destruction of God's little ones?